Berlin before the wall. There is a city that no longer exists, not destroyed by bombs, though bombs had done their work, but erased by something slower, something that arrived not in a single night, but in the accumulation of years of choices, of walls both visible and invisible. Before August of 1961, Berlin was one city. After, it would be two. But in the years between the war's end and the wire's rise, it was something stranger still. A city divided in theory but whole in practice. A place where borders existed on maps but not yet in concrete, where people cross from one world to another as easily as stepping off a train. What follows is not the story of the wall. That comes later. This is the story of what came before. The 16 years when Berlin lived in a state of suspended contradiction, when East and West existed side by side, when families remained families and streets remained streets, when the future was uncertain but not yet foreclosed. If you remain until the end, you will walk through a city that history has since erased, and you will understand what it meant to live in the space between two worlds, knowing that the space itself could not last. Let us begin in the rubble, in the silence after the guns. In the spring of 1945, Berlin was a corpse of a city. The bombing had been relentless. Years of it, waves of aircraft turning the capital of the Reich into a landscape of craters and shells. Then came the Soviet assault, street by street, building by building, until the city that had launched a war of annihilation found itself annihilated in return. The Reichstag burned. The Brandenburg Gate stood scarred but standing amid fields of debris. The great avenues that had once hosted torchlight parades were now clogged with rubble, with the burned-out husks of vehicles, with the bodies of those who had not survived the final days. The silence that followed the surrender was the silence of exhaustion. The guns stopped. The planes no longer came. But the city did not return to life. It remained suspended in a kind of death, its survivors emerging from cellars and shelters to find that the world they had known no longer existed. There was no government, no police, no functioning economy. There was only hunger and rubble, and the slow realization that the war was truly over, and that something else, something not yet defined, was about to begin. The victors divided the city as they had divided the country. Berlin, deep within the Soviet zone of occupation, was itself split into four sectors: Soviet, American, British, French. The lines were drawn on maps, following streets and canals and railway lines, creating boundaries that were administrative rather than physical. There were no walls, no fences, no checkpoints in those first months. The city was too broken, its conquerors too focused on the immediate business of occupation, to worry about controlling movement within the ruins. The people of Berlin, those who remained, those who had survived, cared little for the zones in those early days. They cared about food. They cared about shelter. They cared about finding family members who had disappeared in the chaos of the war's end. They moved to the rubble without regard for which sector they were in, because the rubble looked the same everywhere, and the hunger felt the same, and the future was equally uncertain no matter which flag flew over the nearest pile of bricks. The women cleared the streets. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, formed chains of pass broken stones from hand to hand, slowly dismantling what the bombs had destroyed, salvaging bricks that might be used again, creating paths through the devastation. They worked for ration cards, for the hope of food, for something to do in a world that had lost all other structure. The men were largely gone, dead, or in prisoner of war camps, or simply vanished in the chaos. The work of survival fell to those who remained. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the city began to breathe again. By 1948, the outlines of the future had begun to emerge, though few understood yet what shape that future would take. The cooperation between the wartime allies had curdled into suspicion, then hostility. The Soviets and the Western powers no longer agreed on what Germany should become, how it should be governed, whether it should be reunited or kept divided. The arguments played out in conference rooms far from Berlin, but their consequences landed in the city streets. When the Western powers introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in their zones, the Soviets responded by blocking all land routes into West Berlin. The blockade began in June of 1948 and lasted nearly a year. The western sectors of the city, surrounded entirely by Soviet-controlled territory, were cut off from overland supply. The trains stopped running. The trucks could not pass. 2 million people in West Berlin faced the prospect of starvation, of freezing in the coming winter, of being forced by deprivation to accept Soviet terms. What followed became legend. The airlift, the constant drone of aircraft overhead, the planes landing every few minutes at Tempelhof and Gatto, bringing coal and flour and medicine and hope. The children who gathered at the airfield fences, watching the planes come and go. The candy dropped on tiny parachutes by American pilots, who became known as the Rasenbomber, the Raisin Bombers. The city that had been bombed from the air now fed from the air, sustained by the same technology that had nearly destroyed it. The blockade failed. The Soviets lifted it in May of 1949, having achieved nothing but a hardening of the division they had sought to prevent. West Berlin remained in Western hands, an island of capitalism deep within the socialist East. The airlift had proven that the city could be supplied by air indefinitely, that it could not be starved into submission, that the Western powers would not abandon their sectors. But the blockade had also proven something else, that Berlin was no longer one city in any meaningful sense. The 4 sectors had become 2 camps. The cooperation of the immediate post-war years had ended. The Cold War had arrived, and Berlin was its front line. In the years that followed, the city rebuilt itself, but it rebuilt in 2 directions, toward 2 different futures that grew more distinct with each passing year. In the East, the rubble gave way to the architecture of socialism. Stalin Alley rose from the ruins, a grand boulevard of workers' palaces, monumental buildings in Soviet style, designed to demonstrate the superiority of the socialist system. The apartments were spacious by the standards of time, equipped with modern conveniences, allocated to workers who had proven their loyalty to the new order. The avenue was a showcase, a statement, a declaration that the German Democratic Republic, established in 1949, would build a new society from the ashes of the old. In the West, the rebuilding took a different form. The ruins gave way to department stores and cinemas, to neon signs and shop windows filled with goods, to the bustling commerce of a market economy fueled by American aid. The Kurfürstendamm became the showcase of the West, its cafes and boutiques advertising a prosperity that was part achievement, part propaganda. The contrast with the East was deliberate, cultivated, weaponized. Every lit window was an argument. Every full shop was a victory in the competition for hearts and minds. But the division was not yet total. The sectors had different currencies, different governments, different ideologies, but they did not yet have different populations. Families still lived on both sides. Workers still crossed the sector boundaries to reach their jobs. Students in the East attended universities in the West. Couples who had met before the war continued to meet after it, even as the systems around them diverged. The S-Bahn, the urban railway, ran through all sectors, its routes paying no attention to the political boundaries below. A resident of East Berlin could board a train at Alexanderplatz, ride through stations in the Soviet sector, pass without stopping into the Western sectors, and emerge at the Zoo station in the heart of capitalist West Berlin. The journey took minutes. There were no passport checks, no guards, no walls. The train simply moved, and the passengers moved with it, and the border existed in theory but not yet in practice. This was the strange reality of Berlin in the 1950s, a city divided and undivided, split and whole, 2 systems coexisting within a single urban space. The boundaries were known but permeable. The differences were visible but not insurmountable. The future was uncertain, but the present was livable, and that was enough for those who lived it. To understand what Berlin was before the wall, one must understand what it meant to cross the border that was not yet a wall. The crossing points existed. They would later become famous as checkpoints, as symbols of division. But in those years, they were simply places where the sector boundary happened to intersect a major road or railway line. There were signs indicating which sector you were entering. There were sometimes police officers, sometimes not. If you were a Berliner, you crossed without thinking much about it, the way you might cross from one neighborhood to another. In the morning, the trains filled with Grenzgänger, border crossers, workers who lived in one sector and worked in another. They were drawn by wages, by opportunity, by the simple geography of employment in a city that had been divided without regard for where people actually lived and worked. A factory worker might live in Pankow in the east, but work in a West Berlin plant that paid in hard Western currency. A secretary might live in Kreuzberg in the West, but take the S-Bahn each day to an office in the Eastern sector. The East German government did not like the Grenzgänger. They drained talent and labor from the socialist economy. They earned Western marks and spent them in Western shops, contributing nothing to the construction of socialism. They saw the abundance of the West and carried that knowledge back to the East, undermining the official narrative that the GDR was building a better future than the decadent capitalists could offer. But the government could not stop them. Not yet. The borders were too porous, the crossings too numerous, the habit of movement too deeply ingrained. To seal the border would be to admit that the socialist system could not compete, that people would leave if given the choice, that the GDR was a prison rather than a paradise. And so the crossings continued, day after day, year after year, as the tension built toward a breaking point that most people could sense but few could predict. The young people were leaving. This was a fact that kept the leaders of the GDR awake at night, that appeared in classified reports and worried memoranda, that represented an existential threat to the socialist project. The young people, the educated, the skilled, the ambitious, were leaving. They crossed into West Berlin and did not come back. They registered as refugees, received Western documents, flew out of Tempelhof to new lives in the Federal Republic or beyond. The numbers were staggering. In 1953, more than 300,000 people fled the GDR. In 1956, nearly 280,000. In 1957, over 260,000. Year after year, the hemorrhage continued. Doctors and engineers, teachers and technicians, students who had been educated at socialist expense and then took their skills to the capitalist West. The GDR was bleeding talent, losing the very people it needed to build the socialist future it promised. They left for many reasons. Some left for politics, unwilling to live under a system that demanded conformity and punished dissent. Some left for economics, drawn by the higher wages and greater opportunities of the West. Some left for family, following relatives who had already gone. Some left simply because they could, because the border was open, because the train still ran, because tomorrow the door might close and today it was still ajar. The process was simple, almost bureaucratic. You packed a small bag, not too much, nothing that would arouse suspicion. You told no one or almost no one, because informants were everywhere and a careless word could mean arrest. You took the S-Bahn to one of the western sectors. You walked to a refugee reception center. There were several, Marienfeld being the largest, and you registered. You answered questions, filled out forms, proved you were who you claimed to be, and then you were out. You were in the West. You were free, or at least free from the GDR, free to build whatever life you could manage in a new world. The families left behind learned to read the silences. A son who stopped visiting. A daughter whose letters suddenly came from a West German address. A colleague whose desk sat empty one Monday morning, whose name was no longer spoken, who had become a non-person in the carefully maintained fiction that no one wanted to leave the workers' paradise. The summer of 1961 arrived like any other summer. The cafes filled with customers seeking shade. The lakes around the city drew swimmers and sunbathers. The S-Bahn ran its routes, the trains crossing from east to west and back again, carrying the daily flow of workers and shoppers and visitors, and those who were quietly saying goodbye to everything they had known. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building. The flow of refugees had not slowed. It had accelerated. In July 1961, more than 30,000 people fled the GDR, most of them through Berlin. In the first 12 days of August, another 21,000 followed. The socialist state was emptying out, its population voting with their feet, its future draining away to the open wound of Berlin. The leaders of the GDR pressed their Soviet allies for a solution. The border must be closed. The bleeding must be stopped. Without action, the German Democratic Republic would collapse, not through war or revolution, but through simple abandonment, through the quiet departure of everyone who could find a way to leave. The decision was made in Moscow, in secret, with only a handful of people knowing what was about to happen. The timing was set for a weekend in August, when the Western powers would be slow to respond, when the element of surprise might by enough time create facts on the ground that could not easily be reversed. In Berlin, the first days of August passed in their ordinary rhythm. The newspapers reported on the refugee crisis, on the diplomatic tensions, on the uncertain future. But newspapers have been reporting such things for years, and life had continued, and most people assumed that life would continue still. The status quo had held for 16 years. It was unpleasant, it was tense, but it was stable. Surely it would persist. On the night of August 12, 1961, the train stopped running. It happened without warning, without announcement. In the dark hours after midnight, the S-Bahn service between East and West Berlin was suspended. The streets that crossed the sector boundary were suddenly blocked by soldiers, by police, by workers unrolling coils of barbed wire. The border that had existed on maps for 16 years was becoming a border in fact, a physical barrier, a line that could no longer be crossed. By morning, the wire stretched across the city. It was not yet a wall. That would come later, the concrete and the watchtowers in the death strip, but it was enough. The streets that had connected neighborhoods were now severed. The stations that had served both sectors now served only one. The families that had lived on both sides of the line woke to discover that they could no longer reach each other, that the boundary they had crossed so casually had become impassable overnight. The scenes at the border were scenes of separation. Crowds gathered on both sides of the wire, calling to relatives they could see but not reach. Some people tried to cross in those first chaotic hours, slipping through gaps in the wire before the guards had stopped them, jumping from windows of buildings that straddled the boundary. Some succeeded. Some were caught. Some would die in the attempts that followed, as the wire became concrete and the gaps became kill zones. But most people did not try to cross. Most people stood on their side of the wire and stared at the other side, trying to comprehend what had happened, try to understand that the city they had known, the city of open borders, of daily crossings, of families and friends and lovers who happened to live in different sectors, no longer existed. What does it mean to lose a city that still stands? The buildings were still there. The streets still bore the same names. The S-Bahn still ran, though now its routes were truncated. Its western stations transformed into ghost stops that the eastern trains passed without stopping, their platforms visible through the windows but unreachable, frozen in time like exhibits in a museum of the recent past. But the city that had existed, the city of Grenzgänger and Sunday visits, of workers who commute across ideological boundaries and families who gather regardless of sector, that city was gone. It had been replaced by two cities, each claiming the name Berlin, each insisting it was the true heir to the city's history, each sealed off from the other by a barrier that would stand for 28 years. The people who remained in the East learned to live with the wall. They had no choice. Some believed in the system and accepted the official explanation that the wall was necessary to protect socialism from fascist infiltration, that it was an anti-fascist protection rampart, rather than a prison fence. Others knew better but kept their knowledge private, building lives within the constraints they could not escape, finding meaning in family and work and the small pleasures that remained. The people in the West learned to live with the wall as well. It became part of the landscape, a constant presence on the edge of their truncated city, a reminder of the division that defined their existence. They built their lives around it, adjusted to its reality, came to accept as normal what had once been unimaginable. And the city that had existed before, the city of open borders and daily crossings, of 16 years of suspended division, faded from memory. The children born after 1961 knew only the divided city. They could not imagine a Berlin without the wall, could not conceive of stepping off a train in a sector governed by an enemy ideology. The before became a story their parents told, increasingly distant, increasingly unreal, a vanished world that had existed for 16 years and then disappeared in a single night. Walk back now, through the city that no longer exists. Walk through the Friedrichstrasse station in 1959, watching the trains arrive and depart, carrying their passengers from east to west and back again. Watch the Grenzgänger reading their newspapers, commuting to jobs in the other sector, crossing the invisible line without thinking, because crossing was what one did, because the city was still one city, because the future had not yet arrived. Walk through the Potsdamer Platz in 1955, still scarred by war but beginning to rebuild, Traffic flowing freely through what will later become a death strip, a no-man's land of concrete and wire. See the people who move through without hesitation, without documents, without fear, because the border is merely a line on a map, not yet a barrier in the world. Walk through a family gathering in 1957, in an apartment in Prenzlauer Berg, in the eastern sector. Watch the relatives arrive from Kreuzberg, from the western sectors, carrying gifts and news, and the casual assumption that they will come again next week, next month, next year. Watch the children play, unaware that they will grow up separated, that the cousins they see today will become strangers they glimpsed through wire. This is the city that was lost. Not bombed, not burned, but simply closed, sealed by a decision made in Moscow, executed in Berlin, suffered by millions who had no say in what was done to them. The wall that rose on August 13, 1961, did not destroy Berlin. It divided it, separated it, transformed it into something that was no longer quite a city. Two half-cities, each incomplete, each haunted by the presence of the other, visible across the barrier but unreachable. The years before the wall were not innocent years. The Cold War was real. The tensions were genuine. The systems that faced each other across the sector boundaries were genuinely incompatible, offering genuinely different visions of how human beings should live. The division of Berlin was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a local expression of a global conflict that would shape the century. But for the people who lived in Berlin, the politics were less important than the practice. They woke each morning in a city that was theoretically divided but practically whole. They went to work, raised families, built lives, crossed borders that existed but did not yet obstruct. They lived in the space between the theory and the reality, in the gap between what the politicians declared and what the trains permitted. That space lasted 16 years. It was not permanent, not stable, not sustainable. The pressures that would eventually produce the wall were building throughout, and anyone paying attention could see that something would eventually give. But for 16 years, the something did not give. For 16 years, the border remained crossable. For 16 years, Berlin remained, against all logic, one city. And then, on a night in August, it ended. The light fades over Berlin, over the city that was and the cities that would become. The trains still run, but their routes have changed. The streets still bear their names, but some of them now end in walls. The families that once gathered freely now gather in memory, or in letters that must pass through censors, or not at all. The city that existed before August 1961 survives only in photographs, in stories, in the minds of those who lived it and are themselves now passing into history. What remains is the knowledge that it was possible. That for 16 years in the middle of the Cold War, in a city that was the front line of the global confrontation between East and West, life continued across the divide. That people found ways to work and love, and build families despite the politics that surrounded them. That the border existed but did not yet separate. That the division was real but not yet absolute. That world is gone. The wall that rose in 1961 would stand for 28 years, until another night in November, when everything changed again. But that is another story for another time. For now, there is only the city before the wall, the city of crossings and contradictions, of divided unity and unified division, of 16 years in which Berlin was neither one thing nor the other, but something in between, a city that no longer exists, but that existed once, and whose memory remains in the stones and the stations and the stories of those who walked its streets when walking was still possible. History does not end. It merely recedes, growing smaller in the distance, until it becomes a silence beneath the noise of the present, the foundation beneath the streets we walk without thinking. There are other cities, other walls, visible and invisible, that rose and fell and rose again. Other moments when the world changed overnight, when people woke to find that the future they had expected had been replaced by something else entirely. If this story stayed with you, if you felt what it meant to cross a border that was about to close, to live in a city that was about to divide, to walk through streets that were about to become impassable, then perhaps you will walk with us again. The past is not finished with its telling, and neither, it seems, are we.